When you hear about slavery, you might think of the transatlantic trade, ships crossing the ocean, carrying millions to a brutal life in the Americas. It's a terrible story, one you've likely read about or seen in films. But there's another chapter of slavery, one that lasted over 1,000 years, far longer than those 4 centuries. This tale, stretching from the 7th century to the 20th, is rarely taught, not because it's unimportant, but because it's so vast and unsettling, it's been buried by history. This wasn't just about enslaving people, it was a calculated effort to erase entire cultures, languages, and ways of life. Imagine whole communities, their traditions, their stories, wiped out like they never existed. It's hard to fathom, but this system didn't just oppress, it destroyed civilizations with chilling precision. Ottoman records from the 14th century and Islamic legal texts from as early as the 7th century reveal a system of human subjugation unlike anything else. It wasn't random cruelty, it was a machine grinding down people and their heritage for over a millennium. You've probably heard about the horrors of slavery in the Americas, but this was different. It wasn't just about labor. It targeted children, families, and entire societies. Boys as young as 8 were torn from their homes in places like the Balkans, trained to become soldiers or officials for the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened year after year, for over 600 years. Parents watched their sons taken, knowing they might never see them again. Some of these boys, reprogrammed by their captors, even returned as soldiers to take the next generation of children from their own villages. Entire villages collapsed without young men to work the fields or carry on family lines. Languages spoken for centuries vanished. Churches stood empty, tools left in fields. The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of thousands of boys stolen, families broken, cultures erased. It's a story of loss so deep it's hard to grasp, and yet it's barely mentioned in history books. Why? Perhaps because it's too painful, too complex, or too inconvenient to face. This history reshapes how we see the past. It's not just a story of suffering. It's about the deliberate destruction of whole ways of life. As you reflect on this, you might wonder what else has been left out of the history we were taught. It's a sobering thought, one that reminds us how much of the past remains hidden, waiting for us to uncover its truth. Imagine a world where the sound of church bells doesn't call you to worship, but warns of a nightmare no parent could bear. For over 600 years, from the 14th to the 19th century, Christian families in the Balkans lived with this fear. The Ottoman Empire, vast and powerful, had a system called devshirme, a policy that tore children from their homes, reshaped their lives, and used them to strengthen the empire while breaking their communities. It's a story that's hard to hear, especially as we grow older and think of our own children or grandchildren, but it's one we need to understand to grasp the depths of history's darker chapters. Picture a small Serbian village in 1515, a place not unlike the quiet towns we know, with families working the land, children playing in the fields, and parents tucking them in at night. One morning, the church bells ring frantically, not for Sunday service, but as a signal that Ottoman officials have arrived. These weren't tax collectors or census takers. They were there for the boys aged 8 to 18, the healthiest, strongest, and brightest. Families knew what was coming. Mothers clung to their sons, fathers stood helpless, and children cried as they were pulled from their homes. The officials lined the boys up in the village square, inspecting them like livestock, checking teeth, measuring height, testing reflexes. They weren't choosing at random. They followed strict guidelines written in bureaucratic manuals, preserved in Ottoman archives. They wanted the best, the ones who could be molded into soldiers or administrators for the empire. One mother, as recorded in those archives, fell to her knees, begging to keep her son. She offered her home, her animals, everything she had. The official laughed, saying her boy was worth more than her entire village. Another father, desperate, tried to bribe them with gold he'd hidden for 20 years. When that failed, he fought the soldiers with his bare hands, only to be beaten unconscious in front of his 13-year-old son. That boy watched his father's blood stain the dirt, knowing he'd never see him again. These scenes weren't isolated. They repeated across thousands of villages, year after year, generation after generation, for over 6 centuries. It's hard to imagine the pain of those families, the kind of grief that lingers like a shadow. The Devshirme system wasn't just about taking children. It was a calculated plan to break communities and build an empire. The boys were taken far from home, stripped of their names, their language, and their faith. They were converted to Islam, taught Turkish, and trained either as soldiers in the elite Janissary Corps or as administrators to run the empire. Their old identities were erased, forbidden. Speaking their native tongue or clinging to memories of home brought punishment. The empire didn't just want their bodies, it wanted their minds, their loyalty, their everything. And in a cruel twist, some of these boys, now grown men, returned to their villages, not as sons, but as Ottoman soldiers, carrying out the same Devshirme raids that stole them. Imagine a mother seeing her son, now a stranger in a uniform, taking her neighbor's child. The heartbreak is almost too much to fathom. Consider Sokolu Mehmet Pasha, born as Sokolovic to a Serbian Orthodox family. At 10, he was taken from his village near Visegrad. His mother tried to give him a piece of bread for the journey, but the soldiers knocked it from her hands. 40 years later, he was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the second most powerful man in the known world. With that power, he led military campaigns against his own homeland, ordering raids on Serbian villages, just like the one he was stolen from. It's hard to wrap our minds around it. How could someone be so transformed that they'd turn on their own people? Yet, there's a flicker of complexity in his story. He built a bridge in his hometown, the famous Bridge on the Drina, which some say shows he remembered his roots. But the truth is darker. That bridge made it easier for Ottoman armies to invade Serbian lands. Even his gift to his birthplace was a tool of conquest. The impact on these communities was devastating. Take the village of Gier-Podinier in 1463. Ottoman collectors took every boy between 8 and 18, every single one. Without young men, the fields went unplowed. Without sons, family lines ended. The women and elderly tried to keep the village alive, but it was impossible. Within 25 years, the village was abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows houses left with possessions inside, tools dropped in fields, churches crumbling. Ottoman records, meticulous as they were, document the heartbreak. One father wrote, "They took my Marco when he had just learned to help with the harvest. His mother never spoke again. She lived 10 more years, but never said another word." Another mother, mad with grief, set a place at the table for her son every night for 30 years, talking to an empty chair as if he might return. The selection process was chillingly precise. Officials sought specific qualities: intelligence, tested with puzzles, physical perfection, with no defects allowed. Even family histories were checked for hereditary diseases. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a scientific system, refined over centuries, to create a warrior class and loyal administrators from stolen children. Parents, desperate to save their sons, sometimes resorted to unthinkable measures. Some cut off a finger or toe to make their child imperfect and unfit for selection. Others blinded an eye or deafened an ear. The lengths they went to show how terrifying this system was. The Devshirme began in the 14th century under Murad I, meant as a temporary measure during conquests. But like many government programs, it became permanent, codified into law with justifications rooted in Islamic jurisprudence. Non-Muslim children were taken as compensation for the empire's protection from the empire itself. Historians estimate 200,000 to 500,000 boys were taken over the centuries. Each one represented a shattered family, a weakened community, a culture under attack. The boys were isolated, immersed in a new language and faith, and rebuilt into elite warriors or officials. The Janissaries, formed from these children, became the most feared military unit in the world. As we reflect on this, it's hard not to feel the weight of those lost lives. For those of us who've watched our children and grandchildren grow, the thought of them being taken forever is unbearable. This history, so often overlooked, reminds us how fragile our communities can be when faced with such calculated cruelty. It's a story of loss, but also a call to remember those who suffered in silence, their voices erased from the pages of history. As we grow older, we often reflect on the hardships of the past, but few stories are as heart-wrenching and disturbing as the castration industry that thrived for over 1,000 years in the Islamic empires. This wasn't just about slavery. It was a calculated, industrial-scale system of mutilation that destroyed lives and communities with chilling efficiency. From the 7th century to the 19th, millions of boys and young men, mostly from Africa and parts of Europe, were subjected to a practice so brutal, it's hard to comprehend. With a 90% mortality rate, this system turned human suffering into a business, and its records, cold, meticulous, and preserved in archives, reveal a horror that history has largely forgotten. Imagine a young boy, perhaps only 8 or 10, torn from his village in Ethiopia or Bohemia. His family's cries fade as he's marched hundreds of miles, chained and exhausted, to a place like Aswan in Egypt or Damascus in Syria. These weren't small operations, but large-scale centers, processing thousands of boys each year. The Aswan Center, located at the first cataract of the Nile, was like a factory, handling 3,000 to 5,000 victims annually. The methods were crude, using tools more suited to a blacksmith than a surgeon. The goal wasn't survival, but efficiency, and the numbers tell a grim story. 9 out of 10 boys died during or soon after the procedure. Those who survived were forever changed, their humanity stripped away to serve the empire's needs. The boys were chosen carefully, often between 8 and 14, old enough to endure the journey, but young enough to be molded. The march itself was a brutal filter. 30 to 40% died before reaching the centers, collapsing in the desert or succumbing to hunger and exhaustion. Those who arrived faced the procedure, performed without anesthesia or proper care. Archaeological evidence paints a haunting picture. Mass burial sites near these centers, filled with the bones of boys aged 7 to 25, most between 10 and 16. No names, no markers, just pits of those who didn't make it. These weren't soldiers or criminals, they were children, mutilated for profit. Take Yan, a 14-year-old captured in Bohemia, later known as the Prague eunuch. Marched over 1,000 miles to Cairo, he survived both the journey and the procedure, a rare feat. 40 years later, as a palace administrator, he wrote a memoir that chills the soul. He described a recovery room where 30 boys died around him over 3 months. It was a factory of death where angels were manufactured through subtraction, he wrote. Even in his position of power, the trauma lingered in every word. His story is one of the few first-hand accounts we have, a glimpse into a world where suffering was routine. The economic side of this industry was as cold as it was cruel. In Damascus, records from 1298 read like a business ledger from hell. A merchant bought 100 Nubian boys for 45 dinars each, spent 500 dinars on transport and 200 on the procedure. 91 died, but the 9 survivors sold for 175 dinars each, netting a profit of 275 dinars. The math was simple. Despite the 90% death rate, the survivors were so valuable that the system thrived. They even had insurance policies on slave caravans, listing inventory loss as a standard expense. An intact boy was worth 50 dinars, a castrated one, 150 to 200. It was a market driven by supply and demand, with human lives as the commodity. Why castration? It served multiple purposes, each more disturbing than the last. First, it prevented slaves from having children, ensuring no new generations could dream of freedom. Second, it created total dependency. Eunuchs couldn't form families or challenge their master's power. Third, it was about control, breaking a person in the most intimate way possible. Eunuchs were considered safe to guard harems or manage palaces, their mutilation making them valuable. The demand was endless. Harems, mosques, and palaces all needed eunuchs, and the industry spread wherever the empires expanded, from Cairo to Cordoba. The scale is staggering. Historians estimate 5 to 8 million boys and men underwent this procedure over the centuries, with 4.5 to 7.2 million deaths. This wasn't a side effect. It was deliberate. Medical knowledge existed to make the procedure safer. Byzantine and Persian physicians had better techniques. But the crude methods were chosen to keep survivors rare and valuable. Dead boys were a business expense. Living eunuchs were a premium product. Islamic law forbade castration, but loopholes were exploited. Christians and Jews performed the procedures, and boys were castrated before conversion to bypass religious rules. The hypocrisy was staggering, with entire treatises written to justify it. The Ethiopian pipeline was particularly horrific. Annual raids targeted boys aged 8 to 14 who were marched across deserts to Cairo or Damascus. The journey alone killed 30 to 40%, and of those who reached the centers, only 6 to 7% survived the entire process. Start with 1,000 boys. 300 to 400 die on the march, and of the 600 to 700 who arrive, only 60 to 70 live. It's a survival rate that makes modern medical malpractice look like a miracle. The records are meticulous, listing prices, losses, and profits with no regard for the human cost. As we reflect on this, it's hard not to feel a deep sorrow for those boys, their families, and the communities left behind. For those of us who've lived long enough to cherish our grandchildren, the thought of them enduring such horrors is unbearable. These children weren't just victims of cruelty, they were part of a system designed to erase their very existence. The centers in Cairo, Damascus, and beyond were factories of suffering, and their legacy is one of silence. Few descendants, no memorials, no voices to tell the story. This history, buried in archives and forgotten by textbooks, reminds us of the fragility of humanity when greed and power take hold. It's a story we must remember, not just for the past, but to honor those who suffered and to ensure such atrocities are never repeated. As we reflect on the horrors of the Devshirme system, where boys were stolen from their families to serve the Ottoman Empire, and the brutal castration industry that turned children into commodities with a 90% death rate, we come to another chapter of this dark history that's even harder to fathom. The trans-Saharan slave trade, spanning from the 7th century to the 20th, lasted 1,400 years, 3 times longer than the Atlantic slave trade we often hear about. This wasn't just about enslaving people. It was a system that consumed millions of lives, leaving no descendants, no communities, no trace of the cultures it destroyed. For those of us who've lived long enough to see history's lessons, this story is a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the silence that follows when entire civilizations are erased. The trans-Saharan trade wasn't like the Atlantic trade, where enslaved people were shipped across the ocean to work plantations. This was a machine of death, stretching across the largest desert on Earth, designed not for labor, but for destruction. From the 7th century, when Islamic empires began their expansion, to 1962, when the Beatles were singing "Love Me Do" and humans had walked on the moon, 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved. Unlike the Atlantic trade, where descendants built new cultures in the Americas, most victims of this trade didn't survive long enough to have children. The numbers are staggering, an 80% mortality rate during transport alone. 4 out of 5 never made it across the Sahara. Those who did faced fates so grim that survival was often a curse. Picture a boy, maybe 10, torn from his village in what's now Chad or Ethiopia. He's chained, forced to walk thousands of miles across the desert with little food or water. The trade routes, 20 documented paths through the Sahara, weren't scenic trails, but highways of death. Modern archaeologists, using satellite imaging, have found chains of skeletons still wearing iron shackles scattered along ancient water holes. One site in the Libyan desert held over 800 bodies, all showing signs of violent death. Not from thirst, but from being killed when they couldn't keep up. Ottoman records coldly list acceptable losses: 85% for the Chad to Tripoli route, 75% for Darfur to Cairo. They calculated human deaths like shipping costs. The Zanzibar slave market, operating until 1873, was a hub of this horror. European explorer David Livingstone, a man who faced lions and unmapped jungles, called it so nauseous he tried to forget what he saw. 50,000 slaves were sold there each year, 70% under 18, with twice as many girls as boys. Why? Unlike the Atlantic trade, which needed strong men for labor, this system had darker purposes. Boys faced castration or military service. Girls were sent to harems or domestic service, a euphemism hiding unspeakable abuse. The Nubian tribute system was even colder. For 600 years, Christian kingdoms in Nubia paid 400 slaves annually to Muslim Egypt. 240,000 people handed over like taxes. Families were torn apart, villages drained, until Nubian civilization, thriving for 1,000 years, vanished by the 15th century. Cities emptied, churches crumbled, languages silenced. The Zanj rebellion of 869 CE offers a rare glimpse into this world through the voices of the enslaved. In southern Iraq's salt marshes, 500,000 African slaves rose up, working in conditions that make plantation slavery seem almost bearable. They dug salt from toxic earth, drank contaminated water, and were fed a handful of flour daily. Bodies were left where they fell, too costly to move. The rebellion lasted 14 years, but they lost, and history buried their story. Archaeologists later found mass graves with hundreds of thousands of bodies, showing malnutrition, untreated injuries, and salt-damaged bones. The average age at death was 22, with most surviving only 2 to 3 years in the marshes. This trade wasn't about building communities or economies, it was about consumption. Males were castrated or worked to death. Females, absorbed into harems, rarely saw their children grow free. Unlike the 42 million descendants of Atlantic slavery, who created jazz, literature, and vibrant cultures, this trade left no legacy. Historians estimate 11 to 17 million enslaved, but where are their children, their grandchildren? They don't exist. The system was a genocide, so complete it erased its own memory. No museums, no memorials, no voices to demand recognition. It was human trafficking as state policy, with government departments managing sales, tax revenues from human lives, and military campaigns designed to capture more slaves. Paperwork survives in archives from Istanbul to Cairo. Receipts for human beings, forms for purchases, filed with chilling precision. For those of us who've watched the world change over decades, this history hits hard. We've seen our families grow, our grandchildren laugh, and we cherish their safety. Imagine a world where they could be taken, marched to death, or mutilated for profit. The trans-Saharan trade was a machine that devoured lives and cultures, leaving deserts littered with bones and civilizations lost to time. Nubian churches, once vibrant, stand empty. Languages spoken since the pyramids were built are gone. This wasn't collateral damage or natural decline. It was deliberate, a policy of erasure that succeeded so well we barely know it happened. As we connect this to the devshirme and castration horrors, the pattern is clear. These systems didn't just enslave, they dismantled entire ways of life. The devshirme stole boys to build an empire's strength. The castration industry turned survivors into tools of control. The trans-Saharan trade consumed millions, leaving no trace. Each was a piece of a larger machine, designed to break not just bodies, but spirits, memories, and futures. Reflecting on this, we're reminded how fragile our own communities are, how easily history can be silenced. It's a call to remember those who suffered, to honor their lost voices, and to ensure such atrocities remain in the past, never to be repeated. Following the horrors of the trans-Saharan slave trade, which consumed millions of lives across 1,400 years, leaving no descendants or cultural legacy, we turn to another insidious weapon of the Islamic empires, the jizya and kharaj taxes. These weren't just taxes to fund a government, they were precision tools designed to crush non-Muslim communities, Christians, Jews, and others, through economic and psychological warfare. For those of us who've lived long enough to value the stability of our families and communities, this story reveals a chilling truth about how mathematics and bureaucracy can destroy entire civilizations, leaving them broken and forgotten. Imagine living in a small village in 950 CE, perhaps in Egypt or the Balkans, where you're a Christian farmer working hard to feed your family. Every year, you toil in the fields, praying for a good harvest. But when the crops are gathered, Ottoman officials arrive, demanding 50 to 80% of everything you've grown. Not your profit, but your total harvest. This was the kharaj tax, levied on non-Muslims, often alongside the jizya, a poll tax for the privilege of living under Islamic rule. These taxes weren't about revenue. They were crafted to impoverish and humiliate, forcing families into impossible choices: starve, convert to Islam, or watch your community collapse. For us, who grumble about modern taxes, this was a burden unimaginable, designed to break spirits as much as wallets. Take a Coptic Christian family in Egypt, recorded in tax documents from 950 CE. They harvested 100 units of grain, barely enough for 8 people. The kharaj took 70 units, leaving 30. But they needed to save seeds for next year's planting, so only 20 units remained to feed the family for a year. Malnutrition was inevitable. The records note 3 of their children died that winter, and the tax collectors coldly calculated the loss, not out of sympathy, but because dead children meant fewer future taxpayers. Expected tax revenue reduced by future projections, one ledger reads, as if starving children were a spreadsheet error. Their neighbors lost 5 children. The eldest son, seeing his siblings waste away, made a heart-wrenching choice. He converted to Islam. Instantly, the family's tax rate dropped to 25%, enough to survive. But there was a catch. Islamic law meant he couldn't inherit his parents' land. He saved his family today, only to ensure their farm would pass to Muslim hands tomorrow. It was survival at the cost of their legacy. The jizya tax was even more cruel in its execution. In Damascus, Christian and Jewish men paid it in a public ceremony designed for maximum humiliation. Picture a father kneeling before a tax collector, struck on the neck while his children watched. The blow was symbolic, but the message was clear. You are subjugated, less than human. Some men practiced taking the hit so they wouldn't cry out in front of their families. One Christian wrote in his diary, "Today, I paid the jizya for the 23rd time. My son watched for the first time. I saw in his eyes the moment he decided to convert. I cannot blame him." The ceremony wasn't just about money. It was about breaking spirits, making fathers look weak, passing shame down through generations like a disease. The Armenian village of Quid in 1562 shows how this system could annihilate a community. The governor raised taxes to 90% of production, a death sentence. When villagers protested, pointing out they'd starve, the response was brutal. Then die or convert. They tried to resist, gathering weapons to block tax collectors. The punishment was swift. Every 10th man was executed. Taxes were raised to 95% for 5 years, weapons were confiscated, and children were taken for the devshirme system. Population records tell the rest. In 1565, Quid had 500 inhabitants. By 1570, only 50 remained. Most died of starvation, some converted and moved away, others fled to live as bandits. The cemetery shows the grim progression. First the elderly, then children, then women, finally men. By 1566, Ottoman records noted the village was no longer productive. They'd squeezed it dry and moved on. The Andalusian Jewish community faced a slower but equally devastating fate. From 711 to 1066 CE, their records show taxes creeping up. In year 1, they paid 35%, tough but manageable. By year 50, it was 45% with business restrictions. By year 100, 55% with bans on profitable trades. By year 200, 70% with property confiscations. At 355 years, taxes hit 85%. Jews were barred from owning land and confined to ghettos. Finally, a massacre wiped out the rest, with survivors expelled. It was a centuries-long strangulation, each generation facing slightly worse conditions, like a frog in slowly boiling water. No single generation saw the full collapse, but the result was the same: a prosperous community erased. These taxes were part of a broader system, building on the devshirme and castration industries, which stole children and mutilated survivors, and the trans-Saharan trade, which devoured millions. The jizya and kharaj added economic warfare, making resistance impossible. Additional taxes piled on: military exemption taxes, road taxes, market taxes, even taxes to repair churches. Christian and Jewish families couldn't build wealth. Inheritance laws ensured their estates were taxed to nothing or passed to Muslims if a child converted. Muslim families grew richer over generations. Non-Muslims reset to zero. It was compound interest in reverse, a formula for extinction. For those of us who've watched our families grow, who've saved for our children's futures, this hits close to home. Imagine working your whole life, only to see 80% of it taken, your children forced to abandon their faith to survive, your legacy erased. This wasn't taxation. It was cultural genocide, designed to make communities collapse under their own weight. The records, preserved in Ottoman archives, show a bureaucracy as organized as any modern government, with forms and receipts for human misery. As we reflect on this, connected to the slave trade's devastation, we see a pattern of deliberate erasure: children stolen, bodies broken, wealth stripped, all to wipe out entire civilizations. It's a history we must remember, to honor those who suffered and to guard against such cruelty in our own time. Building on the crushing weight of the jizya and kharaj taxes, which drained non-Muslim communities of wealth and hope, forcing conversions and collapse, we now confront the darkest chapter of this history: the deliberate erasure of entire civilizations. The devshirme stole children, The castration industry mutilated survivors, the trans-Saharan trade consumed millions, and the taxes broke communities economically. But the ultimate goal was to delete cultures, languages, religions, histories, so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even know they existed. For those of us who've lived long enough to cherish our heritage, this story of systematic cultural annihilation is both heartbreaking and a stark reminder of how fragile our traditions can be. Imagine a civilization as vibrant as our own, with its own language, faith, and art, suddenly gone. Not by natural disaster or gradual change, but by a calculated policy to erase it. This wasn't collateral damage from war. It was a deliberate act, like highlighting text on a page and hitting delete. The Zoroastrian extinction in Persia is a chilling example. For over 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was a dominant religion, the heart of the Persian Empire, with millions of followers from India to the Mediterranean. Their sacred fire temples, burning for centuries, were more than places of worship. They were libraries, schools, and community centers. When the Arab conquest swept through in the 7th century, these temples were targeted first. Invaders ritually extinguished fires that had burned for generations, forcing priests to watch. Over 1 decade, 40,000 Zoroastrian priests were killed, not soldiers, but clergy. The Avesta, their holy book, once copied millions of times, was burned in city squares. Today, only fragments remain, pieced together by modern Zoroastrians like a puzzle missing most of its pieces. The temples weren't just destroyed. Many were turned into mosques, forcing believers to see their sacred spaces transformed into symbols of their defeat. Some were dismantled, their stones used to build new mosques, a deliberate act of domination. Survivors who refused to convert fled to India, becoming the Parsi community, reduced from millions to thousands. Today, fewer Zoroastrians exist worldwide than live in a small city. A religion that shaped a civilization for over a millennium was nearly wiped out, not by evolution, but by extermination. In northern India, Mahmud of Ghazni turned temple destruction into an industry between 1000 and 1027 CE. His armies demolished an estimated 50,000 temples, not in battle, but methodically, as his court historians proudly recorded. The Somnath Temple, a treasure of Hindu artistry, was looted, its gold idols melted, its silver shipped away. The main idol was shattered and embedded in the steps of Ghazni's mosque, so every Muslim entering would tread on a Hindu god. The message was clear: your faith is beneath us. The wealth from Somnath alone was worth billions today, making cultural destruction a profitable enterprise. Mathura, Krishna's birthplace, was erased so completely that archaeologists struggle to reconstruct what stood there. A priest's inscription found buried in rubble reads, "The screams of stone as our gods die echo in my ears. Tomorrow, this city of temples will be a memory." It was discovered 900 years later, a faint cry from a lost world. The Coptic language, descendant of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, suffered a similar fate. Spoken for 5,000 years, it was the tongue of the pyramids, evolving into a living language. After the Arab conquest, Arabic became mandatory for government, trade, and public life. Speaking Coptic in markets grew suspicious, then dangerous, then illegal. Families retreated to private use, but children learned Arabic for survival. By the 17th century, the last native Coptic speaker, an old woman in an Egyptian village, died, taking with her words that had existed since the Bronze Age. Today, Coptic survives only in church rituals, like Latin in Catholic services, its poetry, jokes, and lullabies lost forever. When hieroglyphs were deciphered in the 19th century, scholars had to rely on Greek and Arabic because Coptic, the key, was gone. Buddhist civilization in Central Asia vanished just as completely. Nalanda University, the ancient world's Oxford, housed 9 million books and thousands of monks. In 1193 CE, invaders burned it for 6 months, with monks dying alongside their manuscripts. Layers of ash mixed with human remains mark the site. Bihar's dozens of monasteries, each with thousands of monks, were reduced to zero by 1200. Afghanistan, a Buddhist kingdom for 1,000 years, left only ruins like the Bamiyan Buddhas. Millions of Buddhists disappeared. Some fled to Tibet, some converted, most died. An entire religious civilization, thriving for over a millennium, was erased so thoroughly that most people don't even know it existed. This pattern of destruction connects to the earlier horrors. The Devshirme stole children to break families. The castration industry turned survivors into tools. The trans-Saharan trade consumed lives. The taxes crushed communities economically. But this final act targeted memory itself. Languages, faiths, and histories wiped out. Imagine if English, Christianity, and our libraries were banned, our churches and universities burned, our scholars killed. That's not imagination for these people. It was reality. The loss was total. Art, literature, science, philosophy, gone. The Zoroastrians, Hindus, Copts, and Buddhists didn't just lose their present, their past was erased, leaving no one to mourn them. For those of us who've watched our grandchildren grow, who've shared stories of our own youth, this hits deep. Our traditions, our language, our faith, they're part of who we are. To think of them being deliberately destroyed is unbearable. Yet this history, buried in archives and ignored by textbooks, shows how far cruelty can go when it's systematic. The Islamic empires perfected this erasure, leaving no museums, no memorials, no descendants to tell the story. As we reflect on this, linked to the taxes that broke communities and the trades that devoured lives, we see a machine of annihilation designed to leave nothing behind. It's a call to remember these lost civilizations, to honor their silenced voices, and to protect our own heritage from ever facing such a fate. The deliberate erasure of civilizations, Zoroastrianism, Coptic culture, Buddhist kingdoms, and countless others, through the calculated destruction of their temples, languages, and histories, as we've seen, was a chilling act of cultural genocide. This followed the Devshirme system that stole children, the castration industry that mutilated survivors, the trans-Saharan trade that consumed millions, and the jizya and kharaj taxes that crushed communities economically. Yet, the darkest chapter of this history, one that strikes at the heart for those of us who've lived long enough to cherish our families, is the systematic abuse of women. In the Ottoman Empire alone, 1.5 million women were subjected to dehumanization on an industrial scale, a practice devoid of any military or economic logic, driven purely by cruelty and control. This final horror completes a pattern of annihilation that leaves us grappling with the depths of human suffering. Imagine a young girl, perhaps 14, living in a village in the Balkans or Africa in the 15th century. Her world is her family, her home, her dreams of a future. But one day, Ottoman raiders arrive, not for taxes or boys, but for her. She's torn from her mother's arms, her cries echoing as she's marched away to a fate worse than death. Unlike the boys taken for devshirme or castration, who were molded into soldiers or administrators, these girls were destined for harems or domestic service, a euphemism hiding unspeakable exploitation. The Ottoman Empire's records, cold and bureaucratic, document 1.5 million women enslaved over centuries. But the number across all Islamic empires is likely far higher. These weren't isolated acts. This was a system as organized as any modern industry, designed to strip women of their humanity. The journey to their fate was itself a nightmare. Girls, often under 18, were marched alongside boys across deserts or loaded onto ships, their survival uncertain. The trans-Saharan trade, with its 80% mortality rate, didn't spare women. Many died before reaching their destinations. Those who survived faced a life of servitude in harems where they were treated as property, their bodies used to satisfy the desires of the powerful. Unlike male slaves, who might gain status as soldiers or administrators, women had no path to power. Their role was to serve, often in isolation, cut off from family, culture, and hope. The Nubian tribute system, which demanded 400 slaves annually from Christian kingdoms, included girls as young as 8, selected for their youth and vulnerability. Families watched helplessly as their daughters were taken, knowing they'd likely never return. The harem system was no romantic tale of luxury. It was a prison of exploitation. Women were confined, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters. Children born in harems, if they survived childbirth, were often killed or raised as slaves themselves, ensuring no legacy of freedom. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine a mother, enslaved, setting a place at an imaginary table for a child she'd never see grow. Ottoman records, meticulous as always, list women as inventory, ages, origins, prices. A 1298 Damascus ledger notes a girl sold for 100 dinars, her value tied to her youth and appearance, not her humanity. The banality of these records, treating women like goods, chills the soul. This abuse had no strategic purpose, unlike the devshirme or castration systems, which built armies or administrators, or the taxes that funded empires. It was pure dehumanization, a display of power over the most vulnerable. Girls were targeted not for what they could do, but for what could be done to them. The gender ratio in the slave trade, 2 females for every male, reflects this demand. While boys were castrated or trained for war, girls were funneled into harems or households, their suffering hidden behind euphemisms like domestic service. European accounts, like those from the Zanzibar market, describe scenes too horrific to linger on. Young girls, chained, sold to buyers who saw them as objects. David Livingstone, the explorer, wrote of his nausea at the sight, unable to erase the memory of such cruelty. The impact on communities was devastating. Villages lost not just their sons to devshirme or their wealth to taxes, but their daughters, the heart of family life. Without women, communities couldn't rebuild. The Nubian civilization, already drained by tribute, collapsed as families were torn apart. Mothers, sisters, and daughters were erased from their culture, their names forgotten, their stories silenced. This wasn't just about individual suffering. It was about breaking the future of entire peoples. The lack of descendants, a theme across this history, is stark here. Unlike Atlantic slavery, which left 42 million descendants, this system left no trace, no communities to carry on traditions. For those of us who've watched our daughters and granddaughters grow, who've celebrated their strength and dreams, this history is unbearable. Imagine them taken, their lives reduced to suffering, their names lost to history. The Ottoman Empire's harems, supported by a vast slave trade, were a machine of exploitation, as organized as the tax systems or castration centers. The paperwork survives, receipts for women, lists of their qualities, filed with the same precision as tax records. This was state-sanctioned abuse, a bureaucracy of cruelty that turned human lives into profit. Connecting this to the broader history, we see a relentless pattern. Devshirme stole children. Castration created tools. The trans-Saharan trade devoured lives. Taxes crushed economies. Cultural erasure silenced histories. And now, the abuse of women destroyed the very soul of communities. Each system built on the last, dismantling civilizations piece by piece. The 1.5 million women in the Ottoman Empire alone represent a scale of suffering that defies comprehension, yet it's a fraction of the total across centuries. This history, buried in archives and ignored by textbooks, leaves us with a heavy responsibility. As we reflect on our own families, our own legacies, we must honor these forgotten women, their silenced voices, and the civilizations they were torn from. Their story is a call to protect the vulnerable, to preserve our heritage, and to ensure such atrocities remain in the past, never to be repeated. The systematic abuse of 1.5 million women in the Ottoman Empire, as we've seen, was a brutal capstone to a history of horrors. Devshirme stealing children, castration mutilating survivors, the trans-Saharan trade consuming millions, taxes crushing communities, and cultural erasure silencing entire civilizations. This 1400-year Holocaust, from the 7th century to 1962, enslaved 11 to 17 million Africans, leaving no descendants, no communities, no trace. For those of us who've lived long enough to value our family's stories, this final reflection reveals a tragedy so complete it erased its own memory, urging us to remember and learn. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which lasted 400 years and left 42 million descendants who built vibrant cultures, this system was designed to consume, not sustain. Boys were castrated or worked to death. Girls, absorbed into harems, saw their children enslaved or killed. The trans-Saharan trade's 80% mortality rate ensured few survived the desert crossings. Nubian civilization, taxed and drained of its youth, vanished by the 15th century. Zoroastrianism, Coptic, and Buddhist cultures were systematically erased, temples burned, languages silenced, histories lost. The jizya taxes forced conversions, leaving communities bankrupt. This wasn't slavery for labor. It was a machine that devoured lives and legacies. The scale is staggering. 1,400 years, 11 to 17 million enslaved, no descendants. Atlantic slavery, for all its horrors, left jazz, literature, and communities that produced presidents and poets. This trade left nothing, no museums, no memorials. Why? Because it consumed people like fuel, discarding them when spent. Ottoman records list human sales like inventory, with tax revenues and military campaigns built on this suffering. The Zanj rebellion's mass graves, the skeletons along Saharan routes, the abandoned Nubian churches, all testify to a genocide so thorough it erased itself. For us who've watched our grandchildren grow, this hits deep. Imagine our family's stories, our faith, our language, wiped out. This history, buried in archives, demands we remember. It's not just about the past, it's a warning. Today, we have laws against trafficking, but this was state policy, with bureaucracies managing human misery. We honor the victims by preserving our own heritage, ensuring such atrocities never return. This forgotten Holocaust, unlike Atlantic slavery's living legacy, left only silence. Let's break that silence, sharing this truth to protect our future.